It's recording. Okay. शुरू करें? Hi guys, how's it going? This is Indicast 18, and today what we're discussing is extremely serious. And because of the seriousness of the discussion, we would like to apologize for our getup because I'm literally in my boxers, and Raj is also not wearing very big shorts. But hopefully, you guys can ignore that. So today's episode is gonna be about denial. It's gonna be about sabotaging a movement, and it is also going to be about nationalism, jingoism mixed with religious intolerance. And of course, I'm talking about the Armenian genocide. So, how should we describe the Armenians? Armenians are an Indo European ethnic group who speak an Indo European language, very close to the Iranian people and also close to the Greek people. They have their own distinct, isolate Indo European language, like the Albanian language and the Hellenistic language. And the reason why Armenians are interesting is because historically they ruled much of the Anatolian Peninsula, and later on their size and their influence reduced as other major powers started coming and dominating those regions. And finally, in the fourth century Christian era, Armenia became the first kingdom to accept Christianity as its official religion. And later on, they were subjugated by the Arabs, then the Persians, and finally, no, sorry, they were first subjugated by the Persians for following a new Jewish cult, and the Byzantines and the Persians fought multiple wars over subjugation of Armenia. Then later on, they were subjugated by the Arabs. After being subjugated by the Arabs, they were incorporated in the wider pantheon of the Ottoman era. And like under a lot of Islamic under a lot of Islamic empires of the medieval time, uh, they were considered as dhimmi, just like as the Hindus were considered as dhimmis uh, under the Islamic rule. Just like that, the Christian subjects of various Islamic empires of the Middle East, including the Ottomans, were considered dhimmis, and they were basically put in a position where they had to pay the jizya tax, and if they did not pay, it basically meant that they did not have any kind of protection, and not having any kind of protection in medieval era meant your daughters being forcefully kidnapped and converted to Islam, or your sons being taken away as janissary fighters. So that is the historical context of the Armenians. Armenians don't call themselves Armenians; they call themselves the higher. So yeah, so that is the historical context of the Armenians. And later on, as we approached the First World War, the Armenians started demanding more autonomy within the Ottoman Empire. And as we know, the Ottomans were suffering defeat after defeat around that time. So there was a lot of communal tension. So what we view as inter-ethnic rivalry in the modern sense of history, it wasn't as black and white back in then. It was very black and white back in then, because there were either the Muslim subjects and there were the Christian subjects. So under the Christian subjects, you had multiple ethnic groups, and even under the Muslim subjects, you had multiple ethnic groups. Now, because the Ottomans were an Islamic empire, they would end up preferring the Muslim subjects, and the Christian subjects were subjugated to a lot of violence, rape, genocide. And not to take away from the fact that when the Balkan Wars were on, and the Ottomans were losing a lot of territories in Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, a lot of these places had a significant Turkic Muslim European population who basically faced the same outcome as the Christians in what was left of the Ottoman Empire. And so our discussion today would be, how would we, in the present sense, view the Armenian genocide? Raj, what are your thoughts?
Uh, From what I understand, the Armenian genocide has its roots in the fact that territories of Armenia were taken over by the Ottoman Empire, and initially the Armenian subjects in those areas were not brutally oppressed, but they
Dhimmis,
had to
Dhimmis, just like the Hindus in the Islamic sense.
but they had
Yeah,
to pay the
yeah.
jizya, and they had to undergo more maybe strict revenue policies of the ruling Ottoman Empire.
Mm.
And I think maybe that led to some sustained policy measures that could cause maybe the erasure of the Armenian population, eventually leading to the mass extermination, which led to basically the systematic extermination of about 1.5 million people.
Yes, that
Uh,
is one of the estimates.
and all types of human rights violations like systematic rapes, mass killings, deportations, and all these things were going on at the time. And I think this is also the first event in history which led to the coinage of the term genocide.
Genocide, yes.
So it's historically relevant in that sense, because the coinage of the word genocide came from here. And as a result of this, you have a very painful history that the Armenian population looks back at, and even modern day conflicts and policy measures that are taking place in that area are rooted in the Armenian genocide.
Like the Nagorno Karabakh conflict.
Yes. So I think it had multiple ethnicities within Christians, I believe. In
Yeah.
Armenia, you had the
No, not in Armenia, in the Ottoman Empire.
oh, right. In the
Yeah.
Ottoman Empire, you had the Armenian Christians, you had the Assyrians, and
Greeks, Bulgarians,
right,
all of them abiding to the orthodox traditions of Christianity.
right.
The roots of Armenian genocide can be traced to the late 19th century, also early 19th century, because in 1830 you had the Greek War of Independence. So the Ottomans first lost control over Greek, what is popularly known as Yunan, and after losing control of Greece, uh, gradually, like dominoes, most of Armenian Armenian territories in what we call the Balkans started collapsing and forming their own nation states. So that essentially meant that the Ottomans started viewing the Christian subjects with a lot of suspicion. And finally, the Armenians also started their own revolutionary movement called the Armenian Revolution Front, which was called the Dashkans. Now, these guys started their revolutionary war in what we call the Van region, and of course in other regions as well. Van is a region in northeastern Turkey, which had a significant Armenian population. In fact, according to Armenian mythology, that is one of the most important and sacred sites for Armenians, which is just deserted in Turkey, and it's also a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Um, so yeah, around that time, the Sultan of the Ottomans was Sultan Abdul Hamid. Abdul Hamid basically started his own brigade and different militiamen who carried out rampant massacres against the Armenians, which led to around 200,000 deaths. These are popularly known as the Hamidian massacres, and it's only after a lot of international pressure that these massacres stopped. Now, to give you more perspective, around this time, the eastern part of Armenia was under Russian control, and because the Ottomans had started to lose a lot of international relevance, uh, they basically also went on a path of reforms. The masses, the Turkish masses, and that led to the creation of the CUP, which is the Committee of Union and Progress. It also has a very Turco-Arabic name called Ittihad Teraki Chemayati. So I mean, again, like the correct thing I would mention in the bottom of the screen. So these guys were basically the reformers, quote unquote. They're pretty similar to the Baathist party, but again, there was an ideological confusion, as there is to a lot of so-called quote unquote modern Islamic movements. Which we saw that with respect to Mr. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's Islamic socialism as well, because these two terms do not go well with each other at all. So it was something similar to that, because in essentiality it was still delving into Islamic majoritarianism, and they tried to convince the ARF to be a part of the new Turkish project, where they also motivated them to motivate the Eastern Armenians who were under the Russian Empire to rebel against them and join them in their greater, uh, in their greater idea of what Turkey would be eventually. And eventually, the ARF refused, and they started encamping themselves in the northeastern areas of Van. And one thing led to the other, and a small insurrection was dubbed as a great threat to the whole Turkish identity. And it was basically used as an excuse to resettle almost 1.5 to 2 million people in different parts of the Anatolian Peninsula, which essentially led to these death marches through extremely arid regions. And so many people died in these death marches that you till this date in places like Diyarbakir you can find human remains, and they're mostly from the Armenians.
I think it's interesting how you mentioned that Islam and socialism are at odds with each other. I
Yes.
think that even the concept of Islamic nationalism is at odds with with the Quranic ideas, because a large part of it speaks of pan-Islamism.
Yes.
So I think
Restricting, huh?
even the idea of a nation state in some ways is opposed to the idea of pan-Islamism,
Yeah,
right?
the whole concept of Ummah basically means that the whole world is yours. Like Nas said, the world is yours. So, so if you restrict yourself into a nation state, your idea of Ummah gets defeated altogether. Anyway, go ahead. Do you have anything else to add?
No, so I think I want to get down to speaking more of the genocide.
Yeah.
The Armenian population, I think, during the time of World War One, was accused of maybe being more pro-Russian,
Yeah.
and that, I think, was used as one of the propaganda tools to mobilize large sections of the population against the Armenians.
Yeah.
And as a result, Armenian intellectuals, journalists, they were rounded up, they were shot, they were killed, and this marks a very unfortunate turn of events in history, which I think is equivalent in terms of death, in terms of destruction, and in terms of the collective misery faced to the Holocaust. In my view,
Yes.
it's as tragic, it's as deeply disturbing, but not maybe as discussed in historical circles, or even if it is discussed a lot in the historical academic circles, it's not really published as much or talked about as much in modern public policy
Yes. There is a
forums.
collective denial from the Turkish state altogether as to the genocide ever taking place. And in fact, the people who were perpetrators of these genocides, specifically people like Talat Pasha, they have like these massive streets named after them. And I have realized this consistency with respect to modern Islamic political violence that we've seen, specifically in the early parts of the 20th century, is that the people who've conducted worst types of atrocities and violence have constantly been celebrated in different Islamic intellectual circles. Take Hassan Surawardi for example, Hussain Surawardi for example, the butcher of Calcutta. He's still celebrated in places like Bangladesh and Calcutta, and he was responsible for like 5,000 deaths, and of both Hindus and Muslims. Like, it wasn't just so, because that's exactly my point. There needs to be some acknowledgement of such atrocious human beings, and they should not be celebrated. They should not be given any type of platform. The fact that these people are given platforms, it just like reopens the wounds, and it makes people even more emotional on both the sides.
Hmm.
There shouldn't be any type of denial. There should be acceptance, and from acceptance there should be reconciliation. Now, another very interesting Turkish perspective that I actually appreciate, and is again not talked about at all, because at least there is an acceptance of Armenian genocide, is that there were significant Turkish Muslim populations, European Muslim populations in Serbia, in Greece, in uh, in Bulgaria, in places like obviously Bosnia Herzegovina, they remained, but all these different places had significant Muslim population, and they were essentially wiped out after the Balkan Wars, and they had absolutely nowhere to go but the Anatolian Peninsula and whatever remained of Eastern Thrace. So when these massacres happened, the establishment of the CUP ensured that when these death marches took place of the Armenians, people who had lost all their homes, their properties, the Turkish Muslims from Balkans, they were the ones who were given the responsibility to guard these quote unquote death marches so that they could get their retribution. It was done by, it was also done by the Kurds. The Kurdish people were also heavily involved in these massacres. The Arabs were also heavily involved in these massacres. In fact, women used to be kidnapped, forcefully convert to Islam. Young boys were taken away. Some women were sold into prostitution. It was quite similar to what Yazidis faced at the hands of ISIS in 2014. So this is a fact. This cannot be denied, and the fact that it is denied is something which only resoundingly justifies the position of the Armenians, and it somehow does not take us to the atrocities that were suffered by the Turkish Muslims of Europe. So if there was like acceptance on the side of the Turkish government, people would have probably given more heed to the number of Turks and the Muslims that got killed in southern Europe, is
Yeah.
my opinion.
I also want to say that we can bring the focus now to the Nagorno Karabakh conflict, because that's something that is modern and relevant to today's day as well.
Yeah.
We saw some tensions in that region in 2023 as well. That region, from what I understand, has two major ethnicity involved. We have the Christian Armenians,
Yeah.
and they speak the Armenian language also. And we
Azerbaijanis.
have the Azerbaijanis, who are primarily Muslim, and they speak Azeri language, and they both constitute a significant population of that region. And you can imagine that the painful historical context that we've just taken you through has rooted a kind of deepening wedge and tension in the region, which people can't divorce their present lives from. A painful legacy carries on in communities and countries much after the incidents that take place, that cause historical injury. For example, even today, Amritsar and parts of the India Pakistan border carry the deep scars left by the partition of
Yeah.
India and Pakistan. So, similarly, the deep injuries left by what was the Armenian genocide, what the communal makeup and what the tensions were around the time of World War One, and then followed a few decades later, around the time of the breakup of the Soviet Union. Those still play a very important role in determining the people to people relations over there. As a result, the Armenians and the Azeris in Nagorno Karabakh are the main conflicting
Yeah.
ethnicities, and violence keeps spiking up. We had issues in 2023, which is fairly recent, and that became a part of the reason why we decided to bring this topic today to discussion,
Yeah.
because the historical sense of injury is deep, and we haven't really seen these discussions go on in public policy forums, especially in India.
Yeah.
Like, we will hear a lot about the Russia Ukraine conflict, we will hear about the Israeli Defense Forces advance in Gaza, but I've rarely ever heard any Indian media outlet talk about this. So, because primarily our viewership is focused in India, although we are happy to let our message be spread across everywhere, but we wanted to bring this discussion here.
Azerbaijanis are ethnically related to the Turks. Their language is very, very similar to Turkish. They are also Turkic people. Azerbaijanis are Shia, though. They are Shia people, and their historical association with Iran has always been higher. In fact, the greatest connection that India, and the most painful connection that India has with Azerbaijan, is that Nadir Shah was an Azeri, the man who sacked Delhi and basically brought it to its knees because he was the Sultan of Iran around that time. So that place in Iran has always been like the kingmaker. And
That's interesting.
in fact, Iran's population is only 61% Iranian. It has a significant Azeri population. And that's why people always got surprised as to why Iranians have like such a soft stance towards the Armenians. The reason behind it is that Iran does not want to perpetuate Azeri nationalism within its borders because it also has a significant Azeri population in the northwest. So it has like a softer stance towards the Armenians. And plus, ethnically, the Iranians are closer to Armenians, irrespective of their religious identity. So it is the Ottoman Empire has collapsed. Now the Soviet Union is capturing all the territory. The idea of religion is being subjugated all across the Middle East. You have the Kemalist revolution in Turkey, where they single-handedly try and put to death some of the members of the CUP. People like Talat Pasha later on get assassinated by the ARF in what is quote unquote called the Operation Nemesis. Became closely associated with the Russian Empire, eventually became full-fledged republic, socialist republic under the Soviet Union. Now, when Stalin came to power, he understood that the Armenians and the Azeris were still reeling with conflict. And true socialist fashion, true communist fashion, what he did was he started settling in more Azeris in quote unquote Armenian areas, and the Armenian areas which were Armenian dominated were given to the Azerbaijani Republic at the angst and at the betrayal of the Armenian people. But around that time, the Stalin government thought that the Soviet Union is never going to disintegrate, and eventually the atheistic idea of living in a socialist republic would trump meager ethnic identities. But that clearly did not happen. The Soviet Union disintegrates, and Armenia, which was substantially better armed as compared to the Azeris, were able to push out the Azeris and, in fact, capture more territory from Azerbaijan and create what we call the Republic of Artsakh, which wasn't recognized by anyone. Now, when the Soviets had captured most of
Artsakh is the word for Nagorno Karabakh, right?
yes, nahi, but Nagorno Karabakh is just like it's on the hills, whereas Artsakh encapsulated more area
Okay,
within Armenia.
right.
So when Armenian Socialist Republic was being formed, what it did was that it went southwards. Once it went southwards, it essentially created an exclave called Nakhchivan, which basically divided it permanently from mainland Azerbaijan, again to the annoyance of the Azeris. So Azeris had a very difficult time getting to their territory, to their exclave, because they always had to cross through Armenia, and Armenians were always angry about the fact that the Azeris still had Nagorno Karabakh, so they were always in this political flux, and this was essentially done to divide and rule, and you know ensure that the political fights never escalate because of
Yeah,
the Soviet
as a
iron
result,
fist.
I think the Azerbaijan geography is quite complex.
It
You
is very
have
complicated.
the major chunk of the country with the Caspian Sea to its east,
Hmm.
and uh, the that chunk's western portion sort of contains the Nagorno Karabakh region. Then you have Armenia, and then you have another small chunk of Azerbaijan which
Mhm.
sort of borders Iran, and which is not really connected to the rest of Azerbaijan from the land route.
Mhm.
So you sort of have to go through Armenia
Mhm.
to come into that portion of
Yeah.
Azerbaijan. The geography is intensely complex, which plays a role in this conflict.
Yeah, so again, now another interesting anecdote is that the Israelis were totally against, and are still very, very passionately against uh, Armenians getting the recognition of the massacres that happened to them as a genocide. They don't support it at all. And I would not go into the details as to why they don't support it, but there is a significant opposition to that. And there are a lot of arguments against Armenians just taking the flag of suffering the genocide, because the Assyrians, the Bulgarians, the Greeks of the region also suffered similar amounts of atrocities. In fact, Assyrians, the amount of atrocities that Assyrians suffered was actually still not discussed enough. And interestingly, both these countries, the modern countries of Turkey, and Azerbaijan, who now, like, a lot of South Asian Muslims view them as like powerful contenders to Western hegemony in Middle East. They are in bed with the Israeli weapons manufacturers, because Israeli drones, Israeli technology was extensively used by the Azerbaijani forces in the 2020 Nagorno Karabakh war, which essentially put a death knell to the Armenian defense forces and virtually ended the Republic of Artsakh, to such an extent that the Russian forces had to get involved. And the main city of Nagorno Karabakh, Stepanakert, did not fall in the hands of the Azeris. Eventually, finally, recently to 2023, uh, after a lot of negotiations, Stepanakert was also abandoned, and all the 100,000 Armenians who were living in Nagorno Karabakh came back to mainland Armenia, and now the border has gone back to its original form as it was in the 90s. And there is a lot of tension in the borders, and it keeps flaring up, kind of like what is happening at the LOC. Quite hypocritical, though. At one front, the Turkey government is always talking bad about the Israeli government because it's, you know, it's massacring the Palestinians. Rightfully so, it should condemn the Israeli government for its massacres. But then why are you using their weapons? Why are you using their military technology to oppress the Kurds and to oppress the Armenians? Because at the end of the day, the geopolitical goals of a country trump uh, religious identity and ethnic identity. This is a message to certain South Asian Muslim friends of mine who believe that Turks are their brother in arms. Anyway,
I think we can conclude this
yeah,
conversation. Uh, Interesting historical
yeah,
context we've established about the Nagorno Karabakh conflict and the Armenian genocide.
yeah.
And we hope to continue such conversations about history, policy, security, all that jazz. So keep tuning in, keep subscribing. Thank you.
Bye. Love you.
Thank you.